The sun was sinking low over the New Mexico desert, stretching long copper shadows across the arid land and turning every cactus needle into a burning shard of gold. Lila Hart had grown up hearing stories about the dangers of the frontier outlaws, wolves, Apache warriors, but no one had told her how the West could sometimes feel heartbreakingly beautiful. A place where a woman might lose her breath. And herself. Her family wagon wasn't supposed to break down. Her father and the other man had ridden ahead while she lingered to collect her fallen belongings. One loose wheel, one patch of unstable ground, and suddenly she was stranded miles from Dustwater with no one to call out to. She tried to stay calm. The preacher's daughter always did. But the desert quiet felt alive, too alive. And the wind carried whispers she didn't understand, so when she heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her, she froze. He stood half in shadow, half in sunlight, an Apache scout, tall, broad-shouldered, his long black hair tied back with a strip of leather. His presence was silent but overwhelming, like a mountain that had suddenly grown legs and walked toward her. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had been taught to fear men like him. Savages, her father called them. Thieves, raiders, heathens, but nothing about the man before her felt savage. He moved with a quiet grace, a kind of respectful restraint that put every nerve in her body on alert. His dark eyes watched her, not with hostility but with curiosity, as if she were the unexpected thing in the desert. Not him. You're alone, he said in low, steady English. Lila hated that his voice made her spine tingle. I'm fine. I don't need help. His gaze flicked to the broken wagon wheel. It says you do. She swallowed. Hard. He wasn't wrong, and that embarrassed her more than the danger of being caught here with him. He approached slowly, giving her time to run if she wished. She didn't move. Something inside her held her still, caught between fear and an entirely different, unfamiliar pull. I'll fix it, he said simply. She stepped back. Why? What do you want? For you to stop shaking, he replied, almost amused. She hadn't even realized she was trembling. The Apache crouched beside the wagon, examining the wheel. The fading sunlight brushed against his cheekbones, highlighting a strength carved by the land itself. And Lila truly hated that her heartbeat changed when she looked at him. She should have climbed into the wagon. She should have prayed. Instead, she just stared. What's your name? He asked without looking up. Lila. She regretted the answer the second it slipped out. He nodded once. Coda. It felt wrong how natural the moment felt after that, two strangers in a wide-open desert with nothing but rustling brush and wind-worn silence between them. Coda wedged a flat stone beneath the wheel, steadied it, and repaired the crack with a mix of mud and sap from his pouch. His movements were sure, confident, and when he finally stood, dusting off his hands, Lila felt her breath catch again. You'll make it back to your town before dark, he said. The wheel will hold. She opened her mouth to thank him, but Coda stepped closer slowly, very slowly, as if he were giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. She couldn't. Her boots felt rooted to the earth. You were afraid, he said softly, but not of being hurt. His eyes held hers, searching deep. You were afraid of me. She tried to speak, but her throat tightened. Then too gently, too boldly, his fingers brushed her chin, lifting her face just a breath. It was the first touch she'd ever felt that didn't demand anything, didn't expect anything. It just was warm, careful, dangerous. And then he kissed her. It wasn't wild or violent. It was slow, so slow it felt like the world stopped turning. Heat rushed through her entire body, every rule she'd lived by cracking like brittle wood. Lila had never known that a single kiss could silence her fears and ignite something she'd never dared admit she wanted. But the moment she felt her knees weaken, she tore herself away. No, she whispered, stumbling back breathless. I can't. Coda didn't chase her. He simply watched as she fled into the rising darkness. When she looked back once, just once, he stood exactly where she'd left him, his voice carried softly by the wind. Run, little dove. I'll find you. Coda watched Lila run until her pale dress blended with the deepening dusk, until she became nothing more than a flutter in the distance, a frightened dove taking flight. Most men would have chased her. Most warriors would have grabbed her arm, demanded another kiss, insisted she explain herself. But Coda did none of that. He stood perfectly still, the desert wind brushing his braids, his heartbeat steady even as his mind replayed the taste of her lips. He had kissed women before, young Apache women who knew the ways of love, widows who sought comfort after raids, even a few settlers' daughters drawn to the mysterious quiet of his people. But none of them had tasted like Lila Hart. None had kissed him back with that mixture of innocence and fire, then torn herself away as if her own desire frightened her more than he ever could. Coda lifted his gaze to the twilight sky. Run, he murmured to himself, but I'll find you. It was not a threat. It was a truth spoken to the earth, the wind, and whatever power guided the Apache people. Something had happened out there beside that broken wagon, something he could neither explain nor ignore. The girl had been raised to fear men like him, yet she had leaned into the kiss before fear overtook her. He felt her tremble, felt her soften, felt her spirit reach for his even though. She didn't understand it. And a woman who kissed like that did not just vanish from a man's life. He walked to the repaired wagon wheel and pressed his palm against the wood to make sure it was holding. He had done the job well. She'd ride safely back to her town, back to the life that bound her tighter than any rope. He imagined her father's stern lectures, the town's suspicious glances. The suitor who probably fancied himself her protector should go back to them, he thought. But she won't look at them the same. He had seen the truth in her eyes. She had tasted freedom for the first time, and no preacher or deputy or gossiping woman could erase what had awakened in her. Coda knew more about the human heart than most believed. You didn't have to read books to know when destiny crossed your trail. He looked down at his own hands, strong hands hardened by hunting, fighting, carving wood, learning the land. Hands that had cupped her face with a gentleness he didn't often show. When he closed his eyes, he felt the heat of her skin again. He could have taken her right then, lifted her into his arms, stolen her away to his people, to the quiet mesas and hidden canyons where the world couldn't reach them. But that was not their way. Apache men did not take women who didn't willingly choose them. She ran because she wanted me, he realized. And she hated that she wanted me. That kind of fear was powerful. But desire was stronger. Coda mounted his horse, a lean, sharp-eyed mustang that sensed his every thought, and began riding in the direction she had gone. He stayed far behind, giving her time, giving her space, but never losing sight of her trail. She left small signs in the sand, the hurried imprint of her shoes, the place where she had stumbled on a rock, the faint indentation where she'd paused, perhaps to catch her breath or pray for strength she didn't feel. He followed each sign with unflinching certainty. By the time he reached a small rise overlooking the valley, he could see the faint lantern lights of dustwater flickering like scattered stars on the earth. A harsh, divided little town full of stern-faced settlers, whiskey-soaked outlaws, and people who looked at his kind with fear or hatred, and usually both. Lila belonged to that world, but that kiss belonged to neither of their worlds. It belonged to something wild and old and inevitable. Coda reined in his horse. He would not enter town, not yet, not openly. But he would watch over her from the shadows where men like him stayed invisible. She didn't know it, but the desert had given her to him, even if only in a moment. And the desert didn't give lightly. He breathed deeply, letting the night settle around him. This is not the end. he whispered to the wind. Just the beginning. Far below, a lantern flickered behind the preacher's house, Lila's room glowing faintly. Coda's lips curved into a slow, promising smile. He kept his vow, not with force, but with certainty. Run, little dove. Run back to your cage. I'll be the one who opens the door when the time comes. By the time Lila Hart reached the outskirts of Dustwater, her breath was sharp in her chest and her legs felt like they were made of trembling air. The town looked different somehow, not in the buildings themselves, but in the way her eyes saw them now. The jagged rooftops, the dusty streets, the crooked church steeple, everything seemed smaller after standing in front of him. After that kiss, she clutched the reins of her wagon as if the wood could steady her racing heart. Lila. Girl, where have you been? Mrs. Greeley, the town seamstress, spotted her first. Her voice was sharp with suspicion. It ain't proper for a young lady to be wandering alone at this hour. Lila forced a tight smile. The wagon wheel broke. I managed. Managed. She didn't dare say more. If she did, she feared the truth would tumble out of her hot, reckless, impossible to hide. Inside her father's whitewashed house, the air smelled of stale sermons and disappointment. Reverend Hart sat at the kitchen table with his spectacles low on his nose, reading passages by lamplight. His brows pulled tight when he saw her. You were delayed, he said, voice firm. A woman alone invites trouble. The words hit harder than they should have. If only he knew. Yes, sir, she murmured. She kept her eyes down so he wouldn't see the color in her cheeks, the way her lips still tingled. Her father returned to his scripture, satisfied that silence meant obedience, but silence didn't tame what was happening inside. Her, when she escaped to her bedroom, she pressed her back against the door and shut her eyes. The room felt strangely suffocating, the neat quilt, the shelf of prayer books, the window that looked out over Dustwater's straight, rigid streets. A girl raised here was meant to be quiet, dutiful, modest. A preacher's daughter wasn't supposed to feel the way she felt now. Her fingers drifted to her lips. She had kissed a man who was forbidden, feared, hunted, and God help her. She wanted to kiss him again. She sank onto her bed, torn between trembling guilt and a slow, burning ache that refused to fade. Coda's voice echoed in her ears. Run, little dove. She squeezed her eyes shut. Why had he called her that? Why did it sound so intimate, like he knew something about her she had never spoken aloud? And why had she run? Because she was afraid of him? No, not him. She was afraid of herself. A sharp knock broke through her thoughts. Evening. Miss Hart. Blake Turner stepped inside without waiting for permission, hat tucked under his arm and a polished smile on his lips. The deputy marshal was Dustwater's pride, handsome, confident, ambitious. Ever since they were children, the town had paired them in whispers and Sunday gossip. Your father told me you returned late, Blake said, blue eyes scanning her face. Everything all right? Lila forced another smile. Yes, just dusty roads and bad luck. He chuckled. You should let me escort you more often. Wouldn't want anything happening to you. His confidence scraped against her nerves tonight. Before, she would have simply nodded and pretended to be flattered. But now, Blake's presence made her feel trapped, as if invisible fingers were closing around her throat. He sat on the edge of her dresser as though he belonged there. I've been meaning to ask again. Have you given any more thought to my offer? Your father says there's no reason we shouldn't marry before winter. Her pulse jumped. Marriage. To Blake. To this life. To this cage. Lila swallowed hard. I haven't decided. Blake's smile tightened. I'd like an answer soon. A woman of your standing needs security, reputation, protection. The word stung. Protection. As if she were a porcelain doll in need of a glass case. Coda's touch had been the opposite, warm, free, terrifyingly honest. Blake leaned closer. "You know I care for you, Layla. I'd treat you right." Treat her right. But his hand landed on her arm with a sense of ownership, not affection. His grip was firm, too firm, as if he were staking a claim. Lila gently pulled back. "Please, Blake. I'm tired. It's been a long day." He straightened and tipped his hat, though irritation flickered in his eyes. "Of course. Rest well, Miss Hart." When he left, the house felt quieter than before, but not peaceful. Not safe. Her world felt suddenly smaller, closing in around her like a barn door. Lila crossed the room and opened her window, desperate for air. The desert wind brushed her skin. And in the distance, near the shadowed edge of the mesa, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a horse, a silhouette, a presence that made her breath stop. Koda. He had kept his word, and for the first time in her life, the cage she had lived in felt too small to survive another night. Night in Dustwater wasn't silent, but it was hushed enough for a shadow to move unseen. Coda had followed Lila for days, weaving through the scrubland and low mesas that dotted the outskirts of town. The Apache scout could have ridden straight into Dustwater, but he didn't. That wasn't his way. He didn't announce himself, didn't force confrontation. He simply watched, patient, quiet, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows without endangering her. The town slept under a thin veil of moonlight. Smoke curled from chimneys, lamps glowed behind curtained windows, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Lila, oblivious to the watcher, was restless. She lay in bed, tossing beneath her quilt, haunted by the memory of that stolen kiss. Her pulse raced every time the wind whispered against her window pane. A sudden flicker caught her eye. She froze. At first, she thought it was just the sway of the lantern light across the street. Then she saw it clearly, a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the dark hills, still, patient, watching. Her heart jumped. The desert had eyes tonight, his eyes. Coda. For a moment, panic surged through her. The world taught her to fear Apache men, taught her to clutch tightly to her town, her home, her supposed safety. And yet, the fear that washed over her was mingled with something else, relief. He had promised he would find her, and he had. That was impossible, yet there he was. She pressed her hands to the windowsill, torn between calling out and retreating. Coda didn't move. Not forward, not backward. He simply waited. He didn't demand her attention. He didn't threaten her. He offered a silent promise, as steady and unshakable as the land itself. The night deepened, and the wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Coda could feel the tension radiating from her house. Her fear, her confusion, her curiosity, it all mingled together like fire and water. He could smell it in the air, sense it in her energy. Lila Hart was trying to reconcile two worlds she had never imagined could exist side by side. The rigid, oppressive life of Dustwater and the wild, untamed freedom he represented. He slid off his horse with the silent grace of a panther. Each step toward the tree line was careful, deliberate. Every sound of hooves on sand, every rustle of leaves was calculated. If anyone saw him, the consequences would be swift and merciless. Settlers didn't forgive easily, especially when they thought the danger had arrived at their doorstep. Yet Coda pressed on because the desert had led him here, and he trusted its guidance more than the judgment of townsfolk. Inside her room, Lila's fingers curled around the quilt, knuckles white. She wanted to run, to scream, to hide, but every instinct that had driven her to flee from him before now urged her to stay. The wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of a horse's harness, a shadow moving across the hills, closer but careful. Her heart didn't just race, it ached with longing, confusion, and something she had yet to name. Coda stopped at the edge of the property. The moonlight caught his features, the strong line of his jaw, the dark intensity in his eyes, the quiet authority he carried without effort. For a long moment, he simply watched her through the window. There was no accusation in his gaze, no impatience. Only a patient understanding that came from knowing a person deeply, even after only a single encounter. "You shouldn't be out here," he whispered, low enough that only the wind could carry it. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a command. It was a statement meant for her and her alone. She could feel the weight of it, the promise woven into every word. He would protect her, and yet he wouldn't force her to surrender her will. Lila's chest rose and fell rapidly. The world outside seemed both larger and smaller than she remembered. The walls of dustwater pressed in around her, yet in the distance, Coda's shadow reminded her of the wide-open plains, the untamed desert, the life she had never dared to imagine. She knew, in that instant, that he would not leave. He could not. And somewhere deep inside, she realized she didn't want him to. He would wait, she knew. Always, he would wait. The moon slid behind a cloud, and for a moment, the desert and the town seemed suspended between shadow and light. Then he retreated, sliding back into the darkness from which he had emerged, leaving only the memory of his presence, the brush of possibility, and a promise unbroken. "I am here. I will always be here. When the time comes, you won't have to run." And for the first time in days, Lila didn't move. She didn't flee. She didn't even close the window. She simply breathed in the night, letting the memory of him settle into her bones, into her heart, into a place that would no longer allow her to ignore what she truly wanted. The moon hung low over the river, silvering the ripples and turning the water into a moving ribbon of light. Lila Hart crept along the sandy bank, her skirts brushing against reeds, every step careful not to betray her presence. She had left the house under the pretense of gathering water for the night, but in truth, she was heading to the place where she knew he would be waiting, the shadowed bend in the river where the current whispered through the rocks. Her heart pounded with equal measures of fear and anticipation. The first time she had kissed Coda, it had been a fleeting, stolen moment. Now, the thought of meeting him deliberately, under the risk of discovery, made her pulse wild. Her father's stern words, Blake Turner's possessive smile, and the judgmental eyes of Dustwater's townsfolk all swirled in her mind. Yet none of it could outweigh the pull she felt toward the man who had haunted her dreams. A figure moved among the trees ahead. Coda. He stepped forward. Tall and silent, emerging from the darkness like a shadow made flesh. Even under the silver light, his presence was undeniable, strong, poised, commanding. The scent of sage and earth clung to him, and when he turned his dark eyes on her, she felt exposed, known. As though the world had been stripped away. "You came," he murmured, his voice a low, steady drawl that carried across the water. "I had to," she admitted, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I couldn't sleep. Not without seeing you again." Coda's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. He stepped closer, though not so close as to pressure her. "You shouldn't be here," he warned softly. "The town would not forgive you. Or me." "I don't care," she said, surprising even herself with the strength behind her words. "I can't stop thinking about you." For a moment, neither moved. Only the river spoke, the water rushing past rocks and sand, its gentle roar filling the space between them. Then Coda held out his hand, not demanding, not commanding, simply offering. Lila hesitated, heart hammering, then placed her small, trembling hand into his. The warmth of his skin seared through her, igniting a longing she had barely allowed herself to feel. "You ran from me," he said quietly, "and I let you. But now I need you to understand something. You are not alone." Her breath caught. She had been taught that she was fragile, that her body and her feelings were something to be hidden and controlled. Coda's words challenged all of that. They made her chest ache, her knees weak, and her heart open in ways she hadn't imagined possible. "Don't come too close," she whispered. Though even as she spoke, she leaned slightly toward him. "I won't force you," he replied, his voice a promise and a warning all at once. "But I will protect you. I will wait for you, always." The vulnerability in his tone, paired with the strength he radiated, made Layla's defenses crumble. She found herself leaning into him, drawn by a force stronger than reason, stronger than fear. And when he lifted his hand to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the world seemed to hold its breath. "You've changed since the last time I saw you," he said softly, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Not just in appearance, but here." He pressed a finger lightly to her chest, right over her heart. "You can't hide it from me." Layla's lips trembled. I don't know what I feel," she admitted, voice breaking. "Everything is so confusing. I know I shouldn't, but I want—" Coda silenced her with a gentle touch to her shoulder, leaning close enough that the heat of his body brushed against hers. "It's all right," he whispered. "There is nothing wrong with what you feel. The world may try to bind you, control you, but your heart is yours." She closed her eyes, letting the river's cool night air wash over her, letting Coda's presence anchor in a reality she had never dared imagine, that love could exist outside rules, that desire could exist without shame, and that sometimes the greatest danger was surrendering to what your heart had always wanted. For the first time in weeks, Layla didn't run. The river whispered around them. The moonlight glinting off the water, and in that quiet, dangerous night, she and Coda stood together, two souls bound by something far more powerful than fear, far more urgent than reason. And in that moment, Layla understood. She had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Gustwater had never been a quiet town, but the tension that now simmered beneath its surface was different. It wasn't the kind of unease brought on by the desert wind or the occasional rustle of coyotes in the hills. No, it was fueled by the fire that had sparked between Layla Hart and Coda, a fire that the town's deputy marshal, Blake Turner, had begun to notice. And it infuriated him. Blake was a man of pride, order, and control. He had been taught from birth that women like Layla belonged under protection, preferably under his own watchful eye. And now she was changing, becoming distant, distracted, and worse, secretive. Whispers of stolen glances at the river, odd absences, and sudden chills when he approached gnawed at his patience. Something was happening that he couldn't understand. And he hated it. He found the first clue in the most innocuous way. A feather. Not just any feather, but one that was long, sleek, and unmistakably Apache. It lay near the riverbank where Layla had been spotted the night before. One look at it, and his temper flared like dry grass under a lightning strike. "She's been seeing him," Blake muttered, jaw tight, hands clenching into fists. "That savage has dared to." His words ended in a harsh breath, swallowed by his own fury. The thought that Layla, the preacher's daughter, might be drawn to an outsider, a man he had no control over, was unbearable. He called a posse of the town's toughest men, men who owed him loyalty or feared his temper, and gave them strict instructions. "We are going to bring her back under proper care," he said, voice low but full of menace. "And we're going to remove that Apache from the picture before he corrupts her entirely." The plan was simple on paper. Find Coda. Confront him, scare him off if possible or worse, if necessary, and ensure Layla returned to Dustwater without so much as a second glance at the river or its shadows. But Blake's plan carried danger, and not only for Coda. Layla herself was now entwined in a situation that could erupt into violence at any moment. Meanwhile, Lila had begun to notice Blake's increasing scrutiny. The once gentle suitor was now tense, his blue eyes sharp with suspicion every time he entered her room or lingered near the church. Every casual word seemed to contain hidden meaning, every touch demanded obedience. It was suffocating. Yet she could not stop thinking about Coda, the man who had awakened something fierce and free inside her, the man whose presence defied the walls that held her. And Coda, ever vigilant, had sensed the change in the town. He had returned to the river bank in the nights that followed, keeping watch silently. He had not come to claim her, not yet, but the bond between them had deepened. He knew that danger was approaching, and it was only a matter of time before the town discovered what he already knew. Lila Hart would not be tamed. Blake, however, would not wait. Fueled by jealousy, fear, and a sense of ownership he refused to question, he set out with his men one late evening. Lanterns bobbed over the hills, their light flickering like fireflies as they traced the river's edge. The sound of boots in sand echoed through the quiet night. Coda, hidden among the trees, observed them and understood immediately. Lila, meanwhile, had ventured toward the river again, drawn by the need to see him, to speak to him, to feel that moment of calm and clarity he always seemed to bring. The sight of the approaching posse made her blood run cold. The men were armed, and Blake's glare burned like a branding iron. She realized instantly that Coda would be in danger because of her. Not tonight, she whispered to the night sky, fear and determination mingling. Her pulse quickened. She had always obeyed, always conformed, but this time she would act. Somehow she had to warn him, or else the consequences could be fatal. The night held its breath. Shadows stretched along the river bank, the water flowing silently beneath the moon. And in that tense stillness, Lila Hart understood the truth she had been avoiding. Love in the West was dangerous, and those who followed their hearts often paid a steep price. But she would not let fear dictate her actions. Not now. Coda's dark figure emerged from the trees at the river bend, and she ran toward him, knowing the peril yet unable to stop herself. The hunt had begun not for him alone, but for both of them, and the fire that had ignited between them threatened to consume everything in its path. The desert night crackled with tension as Lila Hart ran toward Coda, the river's silvered surface reflecting the moonlight and the shadows of the approaching posse. Blake Turner's angry shout pierced the air, sharp as a rifle's crack. And Lila felt the sharp stab of fear for herself, for Coda, and for the fragile, impossible love that had taken root between them. Coda had anticipated trouble, but he hadn't expected her to act so boldly, racing into danger to warn him. He stepped forward to meet her, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. The wind carried the sound of Blake's men shouting orders, the jingle of guns and boots against sand, and the urgent, desperate cries of townsfolk realizing that what they thought was simple courtship had turned into a dangerous, forbidden affair. Lila, Coda whispered fiercely, grabbing her shoulders to steady her. You shouldn't be here. I can't just let them hurt you, she gasped, chest heaving. I won't let them. Before she could finish, a lantern bobbed into view, and Blake emerged, pale with fury, gun in hand. You don't belong here, Lila, he yelled, voice thick with anger and something darker, something possessive. You're mine, and I will not let that savage take you from your rightful place. Coda stepped in front of her, his stance firm and commanding, every muscle taut with readiness. Back off, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Leave her out of this. You'll get nothing, not her, not from me. The posse hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to advance. Blake's glare hardened as he realized that the Apache would not be intimidated by words or by threats. In the silence that followed, Lila felt a surge of courage she didn't know she possessed. No. She cried suddenly, throwing herself between Coda and Blake. Her voice cut through the night like a whip. You don't understand. He's not the enemy, and I choose him. I choose him. Blake froze, his jaw dropping in shock. The town's rigid rules, the expectations of obedience and propriety, all clashed violently with her declaration. Lila's heart pounded, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she spoke the truth of her own desire, her own will, without fear of judgment or punishment. Coda's hand found hers instinctively, gripping gently but firmly. His presence was a shield, his calm a balm. Together, they faced the posse, a united front of two souls defying the expectations of a small, prejudiced town. Blake's hands trembled, both with rage and disbelief. You, he stammered. You'll regret this, Lila Hart. You'll ruin yourself. I already chose, she interrupted, voice steady. And I'll face whatever comes, but I will not live my life for anyone but myself. And him? A tense silence hung over the riverbank, broken only by the rush of the water and the distant howl of a coyote. Blake looked from Lila to Coda, realizing in that moment that the fight wasn't just about desire, it was about freedom. About a woman's right to choose her own path in a world that demanded obedience. Coda stepped closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. It's her choice, he said softly, but with unwavering conviction. And she chooses me. Blake's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time he saw that neither threats nor social standing, nor the fear of gossip could undo what had been set in motion. Lila's eyes shone with the fire of someone who had discovered her own strength, and the posse began to falter, the weight of morality and impossibility pressing down upon them. Realizing the futility of force, Blake waved his men back. This isn't over, he spat, voice heavy with fury, though he dared not touch her. But, you think you've won tonight, Miss Hart. You haven't. Lila's chest heaved, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into Coda, feeling the steadiness of his presence, the unwavering protection he offered. For the first time, she no longer felt trapped by fear, town expectations, or past hesitation. Her choice had been made, and she would live by it. Consequences be damned. Coda lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle, reverent kiss. You don't have to run anymore, he whispered. You're mine if you want to be, and I'll fight to keep you safe. For the first time in weeks, Lila's tears were not of fear, but of release. She had chosen, she had spoken, and she had embraced the love she had once fled from. Together, they faced the desert night, knowing the world around them might still fight, but their hearts were now united. Ready to face whatever came next. The wind swept across the riverbank, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. And in that wild, lawless west, two souls stood together, fearless and unbound, ready to write their own story. The first light of dawn brushed the desert horizon, turning the sky a wash of gold and rose. The river shimmered quietly, reflecting the early sun. But the world felt entirely new to Lila Hart. Last night, fear, secrecy, and uncertainty had dominated her heart. Now, in Coda's presence, the air felt alive with possibility, and she knew that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. She and Coda sat on the riverbank, her fingers entwined with his. His dark eyes searched hers with a tenderness that both comforted and thrilled her. The desert stretched endlessly beyond them, vast and unbroken, as if the world itself had cleared space for them alone. No walls, no townsfolk, no expectations, just the two of them, standing together against the constraints of the past. You're here, Lila whispered, almost in awe. I thought you might have left. I promised I'd find you, Coda replied, his voice low, unwavering. And I always keep my promises. She leaned against him, allowing herself to feel the strength radiating from his body. Every doubt, Every fear that had plagued her since their first stolen kiss seemed to melt away under the warmth of his presence. The man before her was not only a warrior, fierce and unyielding, but a protector, gentle in ways that only someone who truly cared could be. "I ran," she admitted softly, "because I didn't understand. Because I was afraid of myself." Coda's fingers traced her jawline, brushing her cheek with a reverent touch. "And now?" "Now," she said, voice firm but tender, "I'm not running." She lifted her eyes to meet his, unafraid. "I choose you. All of you." The desert wind carried his low chuckle, deep and full of relief. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was no longer stolen, no longer fleeting. This kiss was an affirmation, a bond forged through trials, danger, and desire. It was the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined before they met. When they pulled back, Lila felt a lightness she hadn't known existed. For the first time, she realized that love was not something to hide, something that needed caution. Love, especially with Coda, was freedom, fierce and consuming. The world might fight them, but they would face it together. Blake and the others? She asked hesitantly, thinking of the posse that had nearly torn them apart the night before. "They will understand in time, or they will not," Coda said simply, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "But we don't wait for them. We make our own path." Lila smiled, a mixture of defiance and relief. The desert, once a place of isolation and fear, now felt like a sanctuary. Every ridge, every river bend, every whisper of wind became part of their story. She could almost hear it singing their names, telling them that the wide-open West belonged to those who dared to claim it. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as they began walking along the river's edge. Each step was deliberate, a rhythm shared between them, a silent affirmation that neither would turn back. The golden light warmed their faces, painting the landscape with promise and hope. "You'll stay with me?" she asked, almost meeting him to say it aloud. "Always," he said, dark eyes glinting with quiet devotion. "You don't have to run anymore, Lila. You never will. Not as long as I live." She rested her head against his chest, letting herself savor the moment, feeling his heart beat in time with hers. The world beyond them, the towns, the rules, the expectations could wait. For now, they had the desert, the river, and the wild horizon. And in that space, they were free. Together, they mounted Coda's horse. Lila held tightly, not in fear, but in surrender to him, to the desert, to the love that had claimed her heart. The horse's hooves kicked up dust, a soft storm of freedom that followed them into the morning light. For the first time, Lila did not run. She did not hide. She did not fear. She was not the preacher's daughter, nor the town's prized possession. She was simply herself, loved fiercely, fiercely free. And utterly alive. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the mesas, Lila Hart and Coda rode into the Wild West together, two souls bound by love, by courage, and by the promise that no matter the danger, no matter the world's rules, they would never be apart again. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and untamed. And in that endless freedom, they found everything they had ever wanted, each other.